Good morning. We continue with our study of Mark. We're working on Mark chapter 14, verses 26 through 52. This story takes place immediately after the Last Supper, uh, and Jesus leaves. And so it begins at 14:26. When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. They sung the hymn, which is the end of the Last Supper, the Passover celebration. And then they went to a place called the Mount of Olives, which you can imagine is a grove of of olive trees. And then, if we go to 27, and Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." We're to imagine that this crowd from the upper room, if you remember in last week's lesson, I pointed out that the picture that we have from Michael or Leonardo da Vinci of the Last Supper of just 12 people being in that room, it seems like it was a bigger room than that. There might have just been 12 people around Jesus, but all of his disciples, the ones that had just started following him and the ones that have been following him for years, women and men, they were all kind of crowding around Jesus at this point. He was so popular that he moved as a crowd, is the way Mark is wanting to tell the story. And so this crowd leaves this upper room and they go to this Mount of Olives, this grove of olive trees. And Jesus does this prediction. You guys are all following me now, but soon you will scatter, because that's what the prophets say. And he tells them, but once you scatter, I'm going to be raised up. I want you to meet back in Galilee. Remember, they're in Jerusalem now. So Galilee would be east of Jerusalem, up by the Sea of Galilee. It's where most of Jesus's ministry happened. It's where Jesus is from. And these words, Jesus will meet you in Galilee. If you remember at the end of Mark, we're going to have a young man, possibly an angel, meet the women who come to anoint Jesus's body after his death in the tomb. And Jesus isn't there. And the young man says, remember, he told you he would meet you in Galilee. So these words will come back. So this is what Jesus says to this crowd of disciples. So now verse 29. Peter said to him, even though all become deserters, I will not. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter vehemently said, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all of them said the same. So now we have this encounter with Peter. If you remember, this is standard for Peter. Jesus talks about his death, and Peter says, no, it can't be so. Peter says, there's no way I'm going to run. This crowd that's around you, they are newcomers to all this, Jesus, but not me. I'm your closest friend. I'm your most valued disciple. I will not desert you. And Jesus makes this prediction, which is famous. The cock crows is a slang term for the bugle call that marked the signal of a Roman guard change, which I believe happened every 3 hours in Jerusalem. They would sound the bugle and then the guards would change. So it's an unusual detail. What it possibly means is Mark is trying to convey to us that this is happening in the middle of the night, that there's a midnight shift that gets off at 3 o'clock shift. And so this has happened between midnight and 3 in the morning. So before 3 in the morning, he's telling them, you're going to deny me 3 times. So Mark's giving us this detail here to help us understand this has happened in the very middle of the night. And that seems important because if you remember, the religious authorities, they're getting irritated with Jesus for his teachings about authority in the temple on Passover with all the crowds there. He's telling these crowds of faithful Jews not to trust the people that are in charge, the religious authorities. And so they're wanting to stop him. They're wanting to kill him. But they can't do it because he's so popular. And so they can't do it in the middle of the day. And also remember that good things happen in the middle of the day and evil happens at night. So that's kind of a standard storytelling feature. And it's here too that In the light, God shines, but in the night, evil seems to be more powerful. And so we're in the middle of the night here, and evil seems to be more powerful. And of course, we know that Peter has the greatest of intentions, but seems to always fall short. And I think it's remarkable, and I'll say this again, we're going to have James and John join Peter in the next part here, that Peter, James, and John are the three central disciples, and yet they are consistently shown to be full of human foibles and deficiencies. And it's just so unusual for a religious tract to show the heroes of the tracts to be so completely broken. And it's, I find it encouraging, and it's one of the things that returns me to faith over and over again. You know, God, you can mold somebody like Peter, you can mold somebody like me. So there you go. So this crowd moves on then. So verse 32. And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and he began to be distressed and agitated. So just those two verses there. He goes to a place called Gethsemane. Gethsemane means literally oil press. So we're in an olive grove, and now we have an oil press. So it's usually called the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a place where they make olive oil, basically is what it is. And he says to the disciples, sit and stay while I pray. So he leaves them outside of this garden, or this area where they make olive oil. And he just takes his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, with him. So the crowd stays outside. And again, this is narrative. Now we're in the middle of the night, and now Jesus is alone with just three other disciples. He doesn't have this huge crowd around him. So this is where evil can happen. This is setting them up. This is exactly where the religious authorities want Jesus to be. And he takes Peter, James, and John with him, not to be his guards, but to pray with them. He's asked his three closest disciples to be with him in this hour of trial. We have a very human Jesus here that cannot be argued. He is distressed and agitated because he's worried. He's even fearful. No one wants to be tortured. No one wants to be executed. And no one wants to die. And Jesus, the very human Jesus, has all those human fears that we have over pain, over death, over execution, over humiliation. He's going to be he knows that the execution that's ahead of him will be him naked on a cross. That's humiliating. No one wants any of that, and neither does Jesus. He's human. He's like us in that, and he wants his closest friends to stand by him now and to pray with him. They're to do a prayer vigil in this Garden of Gethsemane, this place where they make olive oil. And so verse 34, and he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself onto the ground, and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove the cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. So he goes and he tells them that he's going to pray. And then he goes down and he prays. And this is his prayer, that this destiny that he has, that this hour might pass from him, this cup might remove from him, all poetic language about this seemingly path of destruction that I'm on, that there's another way, Lord. And what was pointed out to me was just the simplicity of this prayer, and that this is how Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. Listen, this prayer that he prays in verse 36 is just three clauses. The first one is an acknowledgement of who God is, and usually some sort of glory to God, the goodness of God. So it's Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. So it's an acknowledgement of God, an Aramaic word that means father, that a child would call his own father. For you, all things are possible. So if you remember, our Lord's Prayer starts, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. So it's the same sort of acknowledgement. And then the next clause is the simple request of what we want. Remove this cup from me. Change my destiny. Um, I don't want to do what it feels like you are asking me to do. That's the request. And you remember in the Lord's Prayer, um, now I got to remember it. Take away my trespasses. Forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me. So a simple request for God to forgive us. And then the last clause is not what I want, but what you want, which is like in our Lord's Prayer where we say, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So this is my request, but I'm willing to live with whatever you say must come next, or I'm willing to have whatever happens come next. So this is Jesus's prayer, and you can feel the anguish of Jesus there. And I again, I really think it's important for us to keep in mind just a very human Jesus in this. So verse 37. And he came and he found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. For the spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went and he prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. And he came a third time, and he said, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hand of sinners. Get up and let us be going. See, my betrayer's hand is at hand. So Jesus prays. He has three kind of stints of prayer where he's praying basically the same thing, it appears. And every time he turns around and he looks, and Peter, James, and John are sleeping rather than praying with him. So they're letting him down. And there's all sorts of good reasons why they're letting him down. One, it is probably 1, 2 in the morning at this point, the way Mark's telling the story. They've had a long day. They've had a Passover meal. They drink wine at the Passover meal. And that's the way sinfulness works, right? There's all sorts of reasons, good reasons, why we chose to go right rather than left. But at the end of the day, it's not God's hope for us. And we need to overcome even these good reasons in order to do what God hopes for us. And so that's what this saying means. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. That our body makes demands of us that sometimes aren't what God hopes for us. And he says, pray that you might not come into the time of trial. Is this idea that when we are to be challenged, the only way our weak bodies are going to be able to overcome that challenge is to pray for the Holy Spirit to give us strength in the midst of that. Tony Campolo, one of my favorite preachers, used to say that, when you got tough things happening, keep praying, because if nothing else, that prayer is going to remind you constantly that God is with you, even though God feels far away from you. So it's that same sort of idea. Jesus keeps praying, even though he feels alone, even though he's afraid of what's going to happen. He just keeps praying and keeps praying. But yet these disciples who he's asked to pray with him, his best friends, they fail him. At one point, they don't know what to say to him. He says in verse 40, or it says in verse 40, which is a sign of embarrassment and shame. They have nothing. They have no response. They know they're letting Jesus down. They want to stay awake, but they just simply can't. And then finally, Jesus says, enough. We're done. The hour has come. It's time for God to do what God's going to do. It's time for this to happen. That my betrayer is at hand. And so he gets the three up, and he starts to leave the Garden of Gethsemane. One thing that was pointed out to me that I thought was interesting was that 3 times he comes, and he confronts them, and they are succumbing to the temptation of the devil, not to call the Spirit into the midst, not to strengthen themselves. And And that's the same sort of rhythm of Jesus's trial out in the wilderness. The devil came to him 3 times, but Jesus was able to repel the devil 3 times. These disciples are not able to repel the devil 3 times, and they are going to indeed scatter and leave Jesus and deny Jesus, as we'll see Peter do in a little bit here. Um, so so they had a chance to call the Spirit in to help them, and they didn't, and they're going to end up succumbing to evil. Jesus kept awake, he kept praying, and he's going to be able to live through this painful destiny that God seems to have for them. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing is that Gethsemane, we said, was oil press. And someone pointed out this, that oil press takes the olives and it presses it, puts it under pressure, and then it receives the essence of that olive, that oil. And what's happening here really is Jesus is being put under pressure and we're receiving the essence of Jesus. And that essence is a righteousness to do the right thing with God, to do God's will even though it's painful. So he's put under this immense pressure, and what comes out is this complete faithfulness in God. The disciples, on the other hand, are put under the same amount of pressure in this Garden of Gethsemane. They're pressed in this oil press, and what comes out with them is a failure to do. And it's a human sort of dilemma, right? That when we're put under the most pressure, that's when it becomes the hardest to be faithful to God. Um, and um, and so often we fail when we're put under that kind of pressure. It's easy to be a good Christian on sunny days. It's a lot harder to be a good Christian on the cloudiest of days, is another way of saying that. So, verse 43. Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given him a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him and he once said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And then they laid hands on him and they arrested him. So just stop right there. So narratively, we told the story that this crowd is left outside the Garden of Gethsemane. This gives Judas an opportunity to go tell the chief priests, hey, I got Jesus alone. He's in this garden all by himself with just three close disciples. Now you can send somebody to arrest him. So they go and they go in and they go bypass the crowd of Jesus's followers and they find Jesus alone before he's left the garden. That's exactly where they want him. And remember earlier it said that they were looking for an opportunity to find him alone. So they got him in the middle of the night. They got him alone. It says from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, which indicates that they weren't the ones who went out and arrested him, but it was their guards or their slaves or their servants or whatever that went out to do this. And then Judas arrests them with a kiss, or tells these people who don't know who Jesus is. The chief priests would have known who they were, but these guys don't. They're the slaves or the servants. So Judas identifies them from these 4 people by the one he kisses. And so the kiss then and now is going to be the most intimate way we can greet somebody, right? We only give a kiss to a close family member or to our closest of friends in a greeting. And this would have been the same thing. So you would have heard this story, or you hear this story and you think, wow, this is how close Judas and Jesus were. This is who betrays Jesus, someone that it would be normal for him to kiss in public as a greeting. And you could feel the pain of Jesus that somebody like Judas would betray him. Just like if you had that close of a friend and somebody that close betrayed you. How does that feel? That's how Jesus feels right now. Verse 46, or verse 47 rather. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and he struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And just then Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, even though I were a bandit? Day after day I met with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me, but to let the scriptures be fulfilled." So somebody close to Jesus tries to defend Jesus. Matthew kind of clarifies this when he uses the same story almost word for word. It said it was one of the disciples, one of those three, Peter, James, or John. John tells the story and tells us that it was Peter that does this. One of the Gospels, I can't remember which one, actually has Jesus heal the ear of this slave, and then he gives a little lesson against violence. That's not in this story, but we kind of conflate all these similar passion stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together. But Matthew and Mark are very similar, but Luke and John are dissimilar. They don't have the same details, and they have some different details. But all four stories kind of mesh together pretty well, actually. Um, and then Jesus kind of rebukes them. He says, "You know what? You could have arrested me anytime during the day, but you're cowards. You didn't. You arrest me at night." Um, and he says, as if I were a bandit. Bandit's kind of an interesting word. I'll point it out to you real quick. Uh, Bandit is a specific word for thief. It's like a road bandit is probably the best way to think about it. It's these thieves that would be in the countryside, and pilgrims and people who would be traveling the roads would have to worry about them being robbed as they were going from A to B, and would have to travel down these roads. That's what a bandit was. Romans also called bandits zealots. And zealots were a particular revolutionary Jew who violently opposed Rome. And they would carry long swords in their robes, and they would get behind a Roman leader, and they would give him a shiv in public, killing him in public, and then blending it back into the crowd. And those were called bandits. And there's a theory that Jesus was very close to the zealot crowd. And so that's and the probability is that he was probably killed by Rome because they thought he was a zealot, one of these terrorist revolutionaries within Jerusalem. And finally, the other two people on the cross, on the three crosses, we usually call them thieves, but actually in the Greek it's the same word. It's bandit that they're called. Probably zealots who were killed with Jesus. So we'll finish this now. So then all of them, verse 50, all of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man was following him wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. So these three closest to Jesus, when Jesus was arrested, they fled. All seems to indicate, even the crowd outside of the garden, they must have deserted him and fled. Jesus said to that crowd at the beginning that all of you are going to desert me. Peter says, "No, I'm not." And before the cock crows, before that change of the Roman guard, they had all deserted him and fled. There's a weird detail here that we don't read in church that often. I don't think any of the other gospel writers carried forth this detail either about this young man who runs off naked. Scholars over the years, over the centuries, have played with this and wondered about this. There's a tradition that possibly Mark inserts himself into the gospel, kind of like a painter will put his face in the crowd of a historical scene or a biblical scene. Mark's doing the same here. And then there's a young man that meets the women in the tomb that I mentioned earlier, and that young man repeats the words of Jesus. And so that young man becomes this naked man in this kind of tradition of Mark showing up at the end of the gospel. I don't know if there's much truth to that or not, to be honest with you. There's also a 3rd or 4th century secret Mark gospel that's written, and in that Jesus resurrects a boy and teaches him the secrets of Jesus. And then he runs off to share these secrets with the world at this when Jesus is arrested. So that's in that 3rd or 4th century gospel. Again, I don't think there's a lot there. It just seems to be a detail that Mark wants us to hear how terrified the disciples were. Their flesh was weak, remember? They hadn't fortified themselves with the Spirit, and now they're deserting, so that even when one of the guards or one of the arresting officers tries to grab them, he grabs his linen cloth, which sounds weird, but all it is a toga. It's just one big linen cloth that you wrap around yourself, and they didn't have underwear then. So he grabs his linen cloth and he pulls himself out of that linen cloth to reveal himself to be naked, which is the most shameful thing a man in the East can be in public, is naked. And yet, even though he is ashamed and naked, you would think he would stop and ask for his linen cloth back and allow himself to be arrested. But no, he's going to run through the streets naked because that's how afraid he is. So Mark adds this detail, I believe, just so that we can see the very human fear that these disciples pressed, that becomes their essence, right? Pressed under all this pressure, this becomes their essence. They flee, they run from Jesus. Where Jesus allows himself without conflict to be arrested, pressed, that's his essence. I'm going to trust God. So I think it's just a great detail that helps us see that. We'll have the trial and torture of Jesus next week. Thank you for being with me today.